Can I have the police to 63B Tarnacoy Road for possible murder, please?
What do you mean a possible murder?
Brian Whitlock, who I've just reported missing, has come out to the girl's house and he said he's killed her.
I'm so sorry, like, for her, like, for Wendy, like, wait till you turn her over.
Brian Lyndon Whitelock was born on the 28th of February 1967 in Clydach, Swansea. On Friday the 13th of October 2000, 33-year-old Brian was with his 27-year-old brother Glen and 29-year-old Nicholas Morgan. It's said the three of them were quite heavy drinkers, and on that night they'd met up at Glen's house on Portmead Avenue, Blaenau-Mice, Swansea. During the course of the night, an argument broke out, and as a result, Brian attacked Nicholas with a hammer. The attack was fatal, and in a desperate attempt to cover up what he'd done, Brian went to a local petrol station, got some fuel, came back, and set fire to the house. At the time he'd got back, his brother Glen had fallen asleep. Maybe he knew, maybe he didn't know, but either which way, he still set fire to the house, but not before he'd taken £1,000 belonging to Glen. He then escaped over the garden fence. He made his way to Swansea railway station and spent several hours in a Swansea pub. While in there, he was telling people that travellers had set his brother's house on fire. It was later that day, in the same pub, that Brian was arrested. It was later deemed that Nicholas Morgan died from head injuries sustained in the attack. However, his brother Glen also perished in the fire. His death was caused by smoke inhalation. During the course of the police interviews, Brian claimed that he weren't there when the argument kicked out, or if an argument had even happened, he'd already left. He'd gone to go poaching. But he had also made a fatal mistake. You see, while he was in the pub telling people what had happened, that his brother's house had been set ablaze, he was telling people that Glen had died in the fire, even though at that time nobody had been identified. And despite the fact that Brian had been and changed his clothes, the police found his clothes and they did have traces of Nicholas's blood on them. So at the trial, which was at Swansea Crown Court, I believe, he was found guilty of murder for Nicholas and found guilty of manslaughter for Glen. For the manslaughter of Glen, he was given a 10-year sentence. For the murder of Nicholas, he was given life with a minimum of 18 years, and that was to run concurrently. The judge said, "In the trial, you continued to blame your brother. These wicked crimes brought intense pain to both families, especially to both mothers, friends, and children who were entitled to peace in their lives." Now, I've said it plenty of times before, but concurrent sentences really gripe on me, because the problem with concurrent sentences is serving 18 years life sentence, 18 years minimum, for the murder of Nicholas. So the 10 years for Glen is just going to get absorbed in that. There's not actually going to be any time spent specifically for the murder of Glen or for the manslaughter of Glen. And I really don't think that's fair. Even if it were like overlapped by 1 year, at least there'd be a year for Glen. But concurrent sentences don't see that. There's no point in that 10-year manslaughter charge because he's just doing 18 years anyway. And I know there's point, it's on his record, but punishment-wise, there doesn't seem to be any point, in my opinion. Now, for this case in particular, it is super important that you understand how our system works. So he's been sentenced to life with a minimum of 18 years in prison. That means after 18 years, the parole board can determine if he should be let out, but he'll always be on licence. We do whole life tariffs, but they're extremely rare and reserved for like mass murders and things like that. It was about October 2018 that Brian Whitelock's minimum term expired, and the parole board deemed him safe to be released into the public on licence. But that didn't come without resistance. Leading up to the expiration of his minimum term, in April 2018, Nicholas's sister started an online petition. In this petition, she said, "Look, Brian is being prepared for release, to be released back into the village, into the town, where he killed Nicholas and Glen." Now, that's not technically true. I do believe all life on licenses have a barring from the specific area that the crime took place. However, Brian's from Clydach and the murder took place in Blinomice. So what the family were actually on for is don't let him come back to Swansea. It's not good enough to just bar him from that village that he won't want to go to anyway. Bar him from Swansea so our family, his family, Nicholas's family don't have to see him. It's not fair and will cause far too much pain. They weren't actually asking for him not to be released. And like I said, I do believe this was a petition from both families. A collaboration. In all, the petition raised 1,413 signatures, but it were unsuccessful. Both of the families went on to provide impact statements for the parole board hearing, but the decision was ultimately made. So on the 2nd of January 2019, Brian was released on licence. I have to step back a little bit though, because it was in April 2018 that this petition was made, and it was talking about a temporary release. Now, there was also a news article from Wales Online in April 2018 that talks of the family members seeing him walking down the street. So, for some bizarre reason, he managed to get out before his actual expiration. And I believe that's all because it was only temporary, and I imagine it was like a phased thing for his actual release later on. Still don't think he should have been out, no matter what the circumstances were, but by the by. And in one of these news articles, Brian's own family member said, "None of us have spoken to him since the murder happened. He's evil. There are no other words for him." But it was the 2nd of January 2019 that Brian was officially released on licence. 1 month shy of 2 years later, on the 5th of December 2020, Brian assaulted a shop worker in the co-op, and he also committed criminal damage. Now, life on licence means if you break the law, you're going straight back in. And for the assault and criminal damage, he was sentenced to 12 weeks, concurrent with his life sentence. It doesn't matter what the sentence is, you're back in prison, so it's down to the parole board again to see if you can ever come back out. But lucky old Brian, the parole board deemed that it was safe to be released. They were going to give him another chance outside of jail. And that was in October 2021. He was released on licence once again. On his release, he moved to Tinnacoid Road in Clydach, Swansea. And that's how he became neighbours with 71-year-old Wendy Buckney. Wendy was a retired horse riding instructor. She'd been known for her kindness and generosity. She was described by her family as a much-loved sister and auntie, whose kindness, laughter and spirit touched the lives of so many. Wendy had been born and raised in Clydach, where she still lived. As one of 8 children, Wendy had a close bond with her family, and that included her 16 nieces and nephews, who in turn were devoted to her. She also had 2 stepsons, and despite a divorce, they remained close too. And of course, with being such a nice person, it weren't just Wendy's family that were close to Wendy. She also had a really great circle of friends. She's described as having a heart of gold, and she'd give you her very last penny. For over 30 years, Wendy ran a riding school and livery yard at Penwythedu Farm in Morriston. She taught countless of local children and adults to ride and jump with her horses. That venture was more than a business to Wendy. It was an expression of her love of life and every living creature. It was in 2018 that Wendy, who'd been living on this farm, sold the farm and moved to Tinnacoid Road in Clydach. She was fast approaching her 70s and she'd well earned retirement. She'd developed these mobility issues, occasionally using a crutch. She'd requested additional mobility aids, including handrails from a landlord. Despite all this, Wendy didn't become some sort of extrovert. She stayed really active in a community. She was known for her willingness to help others. And for the loving, caring, friendly person that Wendy was, she readily welcomed Brian into the neighbourhood. Not only into the neighbourhood, into her own home. And she did know who Brian was and what Brian had done in the past. But Wendy believed everybody deserves a second chance. She even went as far as to employ Brian to do odd jobs. Things like gardening and laying down tiles. It was Wendy's way of supporting Brian, giving him some work to do, giving him some money. Although I did read that Brian was working as a gardener. Even Brian himself praised Wendy. He had nothing but good things to say about her. He even went on to describe her as like a second mom to him. Now, up until 2021, Brian had been prescribed diazepam, or Valium as we call it on the street. But when his prescription ended, that weren't enough for Brian. He soon took to the streets and started getting Valium illegally, which, by the way, is a breach of his bail conditions, an opportunity to go straight back to prison. But that's even worse than it sounds. It's not only a breach of his bail conditions. A report in 2016 by the probation service found the risk of Brian reoffending to be low, but it stated the risk would increase if Brian relapsed onto substance abuse. In fact, I think it actually said substance use, not just misuse, not just abuse. And it is also worth noting that on the night he murdered Nicholas, he was high on Valium. So it's only logical to keep away from it, right? Unfortunately, this is a true crime case, so you know that's not what happened. Besides, there's not usually much logic in true crime cases. And Brian himself knew what Valium did to him. He told the neighbour that it sends him loopy and that it makes him go off on one. But nonetheless, throughout August 2022, Brian was abusing Valium and mixing it with alcohol. It said that he was taking up to 30 tablets a day, although he denies that. He also denies mixing it with alcohol, although he does admit smoking weed. And to clarify that, he doesn't say that he never took Valium, he just said that he only took one a day. So it's August 2022. Brian is really abusing Valium, and it's really starting to show. There are a lot of things that occurred during August. Like on the 1st of August, he fell over, hit his head on a tree, which caused him to be taken to hospital. And you go, fair enough, he might have just been drunk or whatever. But on the 16th of August, his neighbour reported him missing. He was later found raving on a bridge and trying to climb over the bridge to get into the water. The police approached him, and according to the prosecution's timeline, he assaulted the police officer, and in the scuffle, in the confrontation that occurred after, Brian sustained an injury. He was taken to the hospital, and a CT scan revealed a small fracture on his skull. But the doctors deemed surgery wasn't necessary, it was best to treat it with non-surgical means. While at the hospital, he was found to have benzodiazepines in his system. If you don't know what that is, yes, it's found in Valium, aka diazepam. He also had cannabis in his system. And throughout his stay at the hospital, he kept asking the doctors for diazepam because it was the only thing that would help him. He also kept saying he wanted to go home, but let's face it, who doesn't when they're in hospital? After a mental health assessment, Brian was discharged on the 19th of August. He was advised to seek help from Daffodil, which is a drug and alcohol misuse service. He still kept asking to be prescribed diazepam, but the doctor at the hospital said, look, you need to go see your local GP. There's nothing I can do for you. So that day when he got home, the 19th of August, his neighbours noticed. And he was limping and shouting police brutality and shouting about how officers had broken his foot and killed his dog. Later on that night, he was heard smashing up his flat. The day after, on the 20th of August, he was out shouting at children in the street, talking about a neighbour's dog that had that C word that 2019, you know what I mean, the coughy thing, the thing that makes you cough. But it said that the children in the local area knew what he was like and they liked to antagonise him. Somebody must have reported him though, because the police did turn up and speak to him. Then later that night at 11 PM, he was seen across road having a conversation with the CCTV. And I believe that's the CCTV that is above Wendy's flat. A neighbour that were witnessing this phoned 101, which is the non-emergency police phone number. That were at 2 AM, and they said that they thought that he was having a mental health episode. And as you can see, throughout this month, Brian is just spiralling out of control. He's using more and more drugs, and his mental health suffering. All the neighbours at this point, by the way, were pretty much always filming him. Be it on CCTV or handheld devices, he was just acting so strange that they were documenting his behaviour.
Brian, try and talk to me. Alright, take your time, take your time. Where's your phone, mate? Have you got any family I can ring? Take your time, Bri.
And the judge would later say that Brian isn't a drug addict. He was just hell-bent on consuming drugs and alcohol, knowing full well how dangerous this made you. All your inhibitions were swept away, and what was left was the explosively violent man inside you. It's important to note here as well that Brian was offered help, but he rejected it. Not only was he told to go to Diafol, or whatever it's called, the drug misuse service, but he was offered prescription alternatives to diazepam, and he rejected it. He self-discharged himself from hospital against medical advice, so he could go home and carry on his self-indulgent spree of drinking and abusing Valium. There's also reports from neighbours, 2 or 3 neighbours, that Brian had made a begins in a B, ends in a B, and he'd made that from a motorcycle battery and some bricks. He'd placed it on his windowsill and said if the police ever tried to force entry into his flat, if the police ever tried to get into his flat, he would use it. But all of this leads to the 22nd of August, 2022. That is the last night Wendy was seen alive. It was at 10 to 7 at night. She'd just got back from the shops in a Land Rover car. She went inside. A minute later, she comes back to her car and then goes back into her flat. Just over half an hour later, at 24 minutes past 7, Brian Whitelock leaves his flat and walks over to Wendy's flat. He can be seen gesturing towards the CCTV, which is attached above Wendy's flat. His gestures is doing like a repeatedly thumbs down motion as he walks across. 2.5 hours later, at about 10 p.m, the neighbour that lives above Wendy, in the flat above, is in his own bathroom, and he can hear some water running downstairs. He said it sounded like the taps were on full, and the main reason he noticed this is because of the time, 10 p.m. Wendy pretty much routinely went to bed around 9 p.m, but as you would, he didn't think more of it. Then he could hear voices. It was his friend and neighbour, Brian, and this voice was coming through the floor from Wendy's flat. Brian were downstairs talking, but he couldn't make out what he was saying. Brian were mumbling, and his speech was slurring, and he couldn't get his words out properly. But this neighbour, knowing that Brian and Wendy were friends, didn't think much of it. So 20 minutes later, he went to bed. When he gets to bed, he can hear this banging or thumping. It sounds like furniture's been picked up and put back down. Still thinking of it quite innocently, and as you would because she employs Brian to do the odd thing, so maybe they're just redecorating or whatever. He takes his medication for pain relief and goes to sleep. Then, a few hours later, in the early hours of the morning, about 5 a.m, back across road at Brian's flat, his joint neighbour is getting some concerns of his own. Now, interestingly, he's concerned because he can hear water running. But obviously, he's all the way across road. He can't hear the water coming from Wendy's. It's coming from Brian's flat. And it's 5 a.m. and he's thinking about all the things Brian's been doing lately. So he gets really concerned and he goes to Brian's flat. When he gets there, it's not secured. So he goes in. And as soon as he's in, it's apparent that Brian's flat has been absolutely trashed. Brian does this quite often, so maybe it's him. But Brian's nowhere to be seen. The taps are running. God, I hope everything's okay, you know? What else is he supposed to think? But again, with Brian's recent behaviour in mind, he thinks, do you know what? I'm just going to turn the taps off. I'm going to go back to my own flat, ride it out for a bit, and then come back later on because Brian's probably going to show back up. So he does. He turns the taps off and he goes back to his own flat. A few hours pass. It's now 14 minutes past 8 in the morning, and he goes back round to Brian's flat to see if he's shown up, to see if he's okay. But there's still no sign of Brian. So he thinks, do you know what, I've got this police friend, I'm going to phone him, get advice off him. And it's about this time that he's looking out of his bedroom window, and he can see Wendy's light. It comes on, then it goes off, and then it comes back on again. This police friend had informed him to just phone the police, report him as missing. So he does that, and then he thinks, you know what, Wendy's a good friend, she'd definitely be concerned about Brian, so I'm going to go over, see if she's seen Brian, and if not, tell her what's occurred, and she'll probably be concerned, she'll want to know. So 7 minutes later, 21 minutes past 8 in the morning, this neighbour goes across road to Wendy's flat. When he gets there, he can hear something from inside. He can hear a person. But before he gets to the door, all of a sudden, Brian comes barging out. And horrifically, he's covered in blood. Brian then starts kneeling on the grass in the front garden. He's grabbing the dirt and grabbing the grass and he's wiping it all over himself. And he says, I've killed Wendy. There's all flesh hanging off her. She's face down on the floor. I don't know why I've done it. She was begging me to stop. So this neighbour then phones back 999. And he says, look, I've just reported Brian missing. I've found him. It was across road at a female neighbour's house. And he's just come out saying he's killed her. Some of the transcript is, he's washing himself in the grass now, on the front. His boxer shorts are covered in blood. Then he turns to Brian and says, what do you mean she couldn't help it? Get away from me now. Stay away from me. You stay away from me. I'm telling you, I'll fucking knock you out. He continues his conversation with the operator. He's wiping the windowsill outside, rubbing himself down. He said he thinks she's dead. He said, she only turned around so I killed her. Beat her up. Other things that were said during the 999 call include, I don't even know why I've done it. She's the nicest person in the world. I didn't want no money off her. She gave me loads, and now I've killed her. I've hit her over the head. I just snapped. There's no reason. I killed her. I deserve to be locked up. I think I've killed her. I have killed her. She only turned around, so I killed her. I never realised what I'd done. I have got a clip, but after writing this, one or two things started to appear on YouTube, so it might get copyrighted and I might have to remove it. So if there's no clip here, I do apologise, but fingers crossed there will be a clip now.
Southwest Police, can I help you?
Can I have the police to 63B Tannacoy Road for possible murder, please?
What do you mean a possible murder?
Brian Whitlock, who I've just reported missing, has come out to the girl's house and he said he's killed her.
Right, okay. What was the address again?
Look, 63B Tannacoy Road.
Tannacoy Road.
64A. Get away, Bri. Stay away from me.
So, has he got any blood on him? What's happened?
Covered in it.
He is covered in blood.
Wendy!
Whose house is
You
it?
killed her. Look, Wendy's house, but he's telling me he's covered in blood.
And
Stay away.
Wendy lives in there, is it?
Yeah.
I have killed her.
I think I have killed her. Yes, I have killed her, he's saying. She only turned around, so I killed her.
During the call, this neighbour turns to Brian and says, where is she, Brian? He replies, dead. I know she's dead, Brian. Where? Brian responds by saying, she's in the living room and she's stone cold. Another neighbour looks out the window and sees that Brian's neighbour is on Wendy's front garden, on the phone. So he decides there must be something wrong. I'm going to go and see if everything's alright. As they were approaching Wendy's house, he could see Brian's neighbour, and he looked a bit flustered. And it was after that he saw Brian. He was still on his hands and knees, pulling grass from the ground and rubbing it all over himself. He asked Brian's neighbour what's going on, and he said, he's fucking killed her. He could then hear Brian mumbling, I fucking killed her. I don't know why. And at this point, Brian's starting to ask where the police are and saying that he expected the police to be there by now. He expected that when he came out, the police would be there. And this neighbour that's just turned up was like, okay, so he's saying that he's killed Wendy, but has he killed her? Is she inside dying and in need of help? So he decides the best thing I can do is go inside and try and help Wendy. In his words, she was in the middle of the room, face down, completely naked. Obviously, he just opened this door and there's complete devastation. The room is absolutely trashed. Blood all over the place. And it's in his mind what Brian's just said. So he thinks, right, I really need to stop now. There's a really very slim chance she's still alive. I need to go back outside and not forensically get involved in that scene. Back outside, Brian's fast talking and mumbling to himself. I don't know why the fuck I killed her. Where are the fucking police? I fucking killed her. I don't know why I done it. But it's too late now. He was just saying it over and over again. And he were, quite correctly, referring to himself as a monster. Just rambling on to himself. And he's mentioning the accident that he's had and saying that the accident's turned him into a monster. As they waited for the police to arrive, Brian's neighbour decided to keep Brian engaged. He asked him what he'd killed Wendy with. Everything. I killed her with loads of different things. I wasn't in a bad mood. I just killed her. You still ask him where the police were and he says, I'm not right in the head. I've killed Wendy. I don't know why. She was so good to me. And at some point before the police arrived, he said, I didn't realise what I was doing until I came down from the high. The paramedics arrived at 22 minutes to 9 that morning, and it was so apparent to them that Wendy Buckney was dead, they didn't even try and move her. The police arrived just a minute after the paramedics, and when they did, Brian was still on the garden in his blood-covered shorts, rambling and mumbling to himself. Brian told the police, and I'm sorry if this is a little bit brutal, when I turn her over, there is chunks, fucking chunks of flesh over her. The police entered Wendy's flat, and they discovered the total devastation that Brian had left it in. Wendy's body was indeed in the living room, and as Brian said, not only was she dead, but she was cold. Of course, nobody can ever be totally sure what Brian did to Wendy that night, but during the course of the night, Brian inflicted a total frenzy of violence upon her, which caused her to die in a brutal, terrifying way. And I will get to the post-mortem later, which I imagine some of you might want to skip. Heartbreakingly, Wendy, who nobody had a bad word to say about, including this absolute monster, she had defensive injuries, which means that she was trying to protect herself. She knew what was happening. But she was old. She was vulnerable. She was classed as overweight. She didn't stand a chance against this drug-filled 55-year-old man, especially one that she just let into her own house and probably weren't expecting to be attacked by. In this brutal attack, Brian had used a knife, a broken table leg, and some MDF shelving that was in her house, and he'd used them to stab her and beat her all over her body and face. He stripped her completely naked, as with himself, hence him wearing his shorts back to front on the garden. As the other neighbour said, Wendy was laying in the middle of the living room floor, naked, face down. She had blood from the bottom of her feet all the way up to her breasts and around her head. Clothes and objects had been placed on top of her body. The room had been totally trashed, including an upended sofa and a shelving unit that had been ripped apart. You might not want to hear this, so mute for 10 seconds. Even bits of her flesh were found on the walls and ceiling. Here's some more footage of his arrest, but again, if it's been cropped out, I am very sorry.
I'm so sorry, like, for her, like, for Wendy, like, wait till you turn her over.
Right, it's not the same thing at the moment, but in my army defence, I'm answering questions, subject anything you do, saying evidence. Anything you say now is evidential, alright?
I know he's on, so he can't be like, only now he's come around.
Right, you're under arrest. Listen to me now. Listen to me. You're under arrest, mate, on suspicion of murder. Don't have to say anything, but in my army defence, I'm answering questions. Somebody later line in court. And you do say.
When Brian Lyndon Whitelock was arrested, he said, Yeah, I don't know why I done it. I'm only now coming around. I just done it for nothing. Like, I don't understand why, like, I've got that C word that makes you cough. Guys, there's something fucking wrong with me. She's definitely dead. Because when you turn her over, she's absolutely fucking shocking. I tried to clean her up, like. Why did I do that, like? I don't deserve to be alive, like. I fucking snapped. I pissed myself while I was doing it, like. She was begging me to stop. I touched her. She was stone cold. She's definitely dead. It's like she's fucking ripped apart, like. Ripped apart. He was mumbling and occasionally incoherent, but he went on to say she was begging me to stop. Chunks of her falling off her. It looks like I have fucking tortured her. I have. I literally have. Oh my god. What have I done? I don't even understand what I've done. I definitely killed her. I'm not doing another life sentence. Even in the police van, Brian was speaking rapidly, without pause. I banged my head on a fucking pipe, and since then they've been giving me Valium.
Oh my God. What have I done then? I don't understand why.
That's plenty, but
my thoughts seconds. I don't know.
that's fine.
I tell you, but we got to walk into the road. Wendy, I tell you, I'll say definitely can do.
And through this drug-fueled mess that Brian's in, and probably some sort of messed up psychosis in his head from what he's just done, because it's absolutely horrific, he's in the back of a police van and he's like bending down double over and he's wiping his nose on his thighs, and the police officer tells him to stop it. I wiped everything. I was in the process of standing everything up. He's been talking that constant and just constantly talking that one of the police officers can be heard in the recording saying he hasn't stopped talking. I mean, that's how much he was talking. These police have witnessed people that are on drugs and what not else going on and on. But he's been that extremely. These police are like, he really hadn't stopped talking. Even when he got back to the police station and he was put in his cell, he was still laid in his cell, mumbling to himself. In police interviews, he told police, she said, "Now's your chance, if you want to have sex." She repulsed me. Like, fuck's sake, I'm 56, you know. My girlfriend's 38. She was going to have sex with me, like. 17 hours after his arrest, he had a blood test, and that found benzodiazepines. Yes, again, Valium, diazepam, whatever. Cannabis was also in his system, but no alcohol was found. It said the level of benzodiazepine that was in his system was consistent with both therapeutic and recreational use. But bearing in mind this is 17 hours after his arrest, and that was done in the morning. It'd been at Wendy's most of the night, although he claimed that he went home and had a shower. That's why the taps were on. But you know what I'm trying to say is, this could have been a good 24-hour plus since he'd had any, and it weren't possible to back calculate it. So it is quite likely that there was a lot of these benzodiazepines, this Valium, in his system when he went over to Wendy's house. Despite the apparent evidence of SA and Wendy being naked, which in its own way is SA, forensic evidence showed that he hadn't ejaculated in or on her, which is such a small saving grace. Trust me, you'll realise how that's such a small saving grace. That being said, an element of old sperm had found its way from his boxer shorts to her vaginal area. We are approaching the point where you might want to stop. I'll put it on the screen here when I do the time that you'll want to rejoin. And I'll probably put like a mute thing up as well, mute symbol. But before we do get to that, the pathologist provided 70 numbered descriptions of injuries all over Wendy's body. They were from head to toe. 28 of them was to her head and face. The other 42 obviously being to her body and limbs. However, there was far more injuries than 70. The pathologist literally could not count the amount of individual injuries because there was injuries on top of injuries. So this is the time you need to skip to. This is quite brutal. It's not extreme, probably. I don't go into too much graphic detail, but it is not for the faint-hearted. There was stab wounds. There was blunt force wounds. There was sharp force injuries to her face, head, arms, legs, and chest. Wendy suffered a fractured eye socket, fractured nose, fractured cheek, fractured jaw, fractured shin bones, and in that shin fracture there was fragments of chipboard similar to the MDF shelving that had been found. Parts of her body had been skinned, not quite literally, but appearing like they'd been skinned. Her nose, upper lip and underlying cheek were partially detached. An injury to the left backside of her head left bone of her skull exposed. There'd been bleeding in the whites of her eyes. Her arms had fatty and muscle tissue exposed. Some of the weapons had been used with that much force. They'd left marks on her skin that showed their shape. Splinters of the wood and other materials were in some places embedded into her body. Her right leg was broken. And I don't know if I said, I don't know the cheekbone bit. If I said the left cheekbone was fractured, that were in 3 places. We're safe to listen again. The forensics later found blood on surfaces all over. In the kitchen, in the hallway, the bathroom, on the sinks, on the taps. I mean, it would just... Everything was absolutely horrific. Brian Lyndon Whitelock is a monster. And very few times in history has monster been appropriately used enough as much as now. This man is so sick, and I don't care if you blame it on drugs or what. If you just listen to that description, that is beyond. That is just true evil. And you might think that this is going to be easy, open, closed case. They found him there, covered in blood. He's admitted to it millions of times, on video recording and everything. But unfortunately, as the monster that he is, despite him coming out with blood on his hands, despite him actually confessing to it, Brian Lyndon Whitelock changed his plea. He absolutely and completely changed his story. His story was now there had been some shadowy figures knocking around a flat. And interestingly, he chose to say that they'd raped her. But by the time that he'd got there, it was too late. He couldn't save her. But that weren't his final story. Oh, no. He changed it again. This time, he once again admitted that it was him that attacked Wendy. There were no shadowy figures. There were no other people involved. Just him attacking Wendy. But he weren't in the right frame of mind. Ladies and gentlemen, drum roll please. We're going for the diminished responsibility yet again. And by God, am I fed up of hearing it. But to be fair, you might be expecting him to say, because of the drugs. No. He was claiming he had a brain injury. He was claiming that earlier in the month when he'd fell in at a tree, or when he'd fell in at a pipe for that time, or when the police fractured his skull, that caused brain damage. And that's what caused him to do that to Wendy. Now, it took an astonishing 27 months before this trial even got started. And that huge delay was because of Brian. He used numerous delay tactics. He fired his defence team. Probably because they said, you ain't got a chance. You're going to fail. You're going back to prison for another life sentence. Although I don't know that. That is speculation. But it's believable. Another delay tactic he was using was asking for further medical evidence. And then ultimately, in the end, he decided to represent himself. I mean, why not? You've not got much to lose. This is not going to go well for you. The trial finally began in Swansea Crown Court on the 11th of November 2024. And let's start with the last thing I've just said. He was claiming brain damage. And this weren't just like a passing claim. This was his entire defence that he constantly talked about. His entire defence relied on him having brain damage. Which, to be fair, it's not a bad call, is it? A couple of years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you might have just got away with that. And you can't use any other defence because you were literally caught red-handed. And all his neighbours have got footage of him seeming unwell. So if you're going to go for a defence, then that's probably the best one to go with. And because of that, there was a lot of experts in this trial. There were neurosurgeons. There were neuropsychiatrists. There were psychologists. Other psychiatrists. And I mean, it weren't unanimous. There were differing reports. Some which had been done after assessments that had been done with limitations. I mean, one psychiatrist said that he'd had a confusional episode. But, to be fair, the majority of these experts ruled out brain damage and pointed towards drugs and alcohol. And like we know, like I've said a few times, there's lots of evidence of how he was behaving on drugs and alcohol. There were lots of witnesses that were saying that, yeah, he was taking a lot of Valium, yeah, he was admitting to it, yeah, he was drinking crates of lager while on Valium. And let's not forget, while he was in hospital, he got drug tested. He had Valium in his system. When he was arrested, he was drug tested. He had Valium in his system. In fact, a doctor who'd carried out the CT scan ahead of the incident believed Brian's confusion in the weeks before was caused by drug withdrawal rather than a head injury. If anything, I think that confuses the case even more. Was he high on drugs, or was he withdrawing from drugs? The court was told just days before the murder a mental health assessment had been carried out on Brian, and that deemed him to be low risk of harming himself or others. So throughout this trial, there's one thing that the prosecution did quite a bit, and that was compare Wendy's murder with Nicholas's and Glen's murder. In both cases, victims were killed in the early hours of the morning and trusted to be there. In both cases, the defendant was under the influence of drugs. In both cases, he was said to be mumbling and incoherent in the aftermath. Of significance, he was not blaming any head injury in 2001. In both cases, a weapon was used to kill by repeated blows, and both victims sustained severe injuries to the face. In both cases, explosive and disproportionate violence was used without any obvious motive. In both cases, the location of the killing was significantly damaged after the death. And maybe that's the reason that Brian didn't want to talk about his past sentence. Oh, to be fair, maybe he just saw it as irrelevant. But he did outright tell the court, look, I am not talking about what happened in 2000 anymore. I'm not talking about the trial. I am not talking about anything. Brian himself told the jury that Wendy was a lovely person. The most genuine person I know. She helped me a lot. It is difficult to talk about. She is a really lovely person. I would do anything to help her. She would do anything to help me. I have no idea why I was at Wendy's or what I was doing. It is horrible what's happened. It's absolutely horrific what I have done. What I have caused somehow. I don't know what else I can say. I'm sorry. I can't forgive myself. I don't think I will ever come to terms with what happened. I expect to spend the rest of my life in jail. I deserve to. Why did I do that to someone? To anyone? To Wendy? Someone who was so nice to me. To do that to anyone at all is horrific. He added he didn't know whether he had done it, but he was accepting his fate. But for someone that was accepting his fate, he certainly didn't act like it. Throughout the trial, he had to be constantly told to stop interrupting, especially with the prosecution's closing arguments. He shouted things like they were playing dirty and talking bullshit. His manners and interruptions were that bad, at one point he had to be taken back to the cells. And even while he was being taken away, he shouted, "Not having this!" On one of the days, Brian wouldn't let the prosecution continue their cross-examination. He just left the witness box. So the following day, the judge gave him another chance. He asked Brian if he'd like to return to the witness box. And Brian replied, "I am representing myself. The prosecution is playing dirty games and twisting me up like that, just to make me out to be a liar. So no." The judge set the record straight and said, look, the prosecution's not playing dirty games. They've conducted their prosecution properly, and then gave him another chance. Would you like to return to the witness box? But Brian again exclaimed, "No, I won't go into the witness box. It's all one-sided. Get on with it." Further on, the prosecution told the jury, Mr. Whitelock must have stripped her before he stabbed her in that way. He was never going to go into the witness box to answer questions about that. He stripped Wendy Buckney before he stabbed her in the thigh. He beat her with a table leg and pieces of shelving. His self-control was not compared. He knew she was begging him to stop. He said chunks of were hanging off her. And even at this point, Brian shouting, "That's a lot of bullshit." But the prosecution continued. He knew she was naked in the flat, having been stabbed by him. In hospital, he made sexual comments about her, saying that she'd said to him, "Now is your chance to have sex with me." Lies. All lies, of course. But he knew the sexual nature of what he did would emerge. They told the court that Wendy had been sexually interfered with. At which point, Brian, once again, shouting out, "This is all wrong, I'm not having it, it's all bullshit." But after a very painful and long 2-week trial, it took the jury just 30 minutes to unanimously find Brian Lyndon Whitelock guilty of murder. Following the verdict, the judge turned to Brian. In another olive branch, he said, "Look, you got rid of your defence team. I will quite happily reinstate legal aid," which means basically a state benefit the government's going to pay, or the state's going to pay for your defence counsel, is going to reinstate that for you if you want to take it up. Because even at this point, you see, the verdict's been delivered guilty, but there's now an argument of what the sentence should be. Aggravating factors, mitigating factors, it's all things that the defence and the prosecution can put forward. So the judge offers him this again. But Brian replies, "What's the point? What's the point? Really? Really?" He then turns to shouting at the jury. "I hope you all suffer a brain injury. I hope you all suffer a brain injury. I hope you all suffer what I went through. You are all bang out of order." Of course, the judge ordered his immediate removal. And of course, Brian was still shouting as he got dragged away. So much for accepting his fate. And then once he'd been removed, the judge turned to the jury. "I apologise for that disgraceful incident. I assure you he is in a place from whence he can do you no harm." Now, before we get to the sentencing, I want to stress to you some information about the whole life sentences. As I've mentioned at the beginning of the video, they are extremely rare. Since the introduction of whole life sentences in 1983, approximately 100 people have received a whole life sentence. That's over 40 years and only 100 people have received it. As of June 2023, in England and Wales, there was only 65 prisoners serving a whole life sentence. That's it, just 65. So, the judge came into court that day, talked about, got the prosecution's points. I don't know if he got any points off Brian, but then went to consider his sentencing. It was very much expected that the sentence would either be a whole life tariff or life with a minimum of 30 years. And thankfully, when the judge returned, he said the starting point for Brian's sentence would be a whole life tariff. But then there's the aggravating and mitigating factors. The first aggravating factor is the sustained, exceptionally cruel and sadistic violence. The second was the use of a knife and other weapons. The third was the SA. The fourth was the degradation of the victim, which includes pretty much everything that I explained earlier that had been done to the body, including piling things on top of her. The fifth is the voluntary intoxication of diazepam and alcohol, despite the fact that Brian knew what effect that had on him. Sixth was Wendy's vulnerability. Moving on to mitigation, the judge said the brain injury weren't going to be any part of the mitigation because he didn't deem it to be relevant, which left three main mitigating factors. Lack of premeditation. He apparently had shown some remorse, which the judge said was at the scene when he came out and he's what they've done, why they've done it, all that malarkey, and apparently during the trial. But he did emphasise that Brian had never accepted responsibility. And the other very weak mitigating factor is that Brian pled guilty to manslaughter. So what he's basically saying there is, although you're not pleading guilty to murder, you aren't trying to say that you didn't do it at all. And again, I don't understand how he could possibly say, I hadn't done it at all. It was literally caught red-handed. So yeah, they're the four mitigating factors. And with all that said, I'm sure you'll be extremely pleased to know that at long last, Brian Lyndon Whitelock was found guilty and sentenced to a whole life tariff. That means he will never be able to be eligible for parole. Quite annoyingly though, Brian didn't see that sentencing because he turned off the video link. In a statement, Wendy's family said, "Today's verdict brings some measure of justice for Wendy, who was taken from us far too soon. While nothing can bring her back, we are grateful that the truth has been heard. Wendy was a very much loved sister and auntie, whose kindness, laughter and spirit touched the lives of so many. Our lives will never be the same without her, but we will continue to honour her memory every day. This has been a painful and heartbreaking journey for our family. We thank everyone who supported us during this incredibly difficult time, and we ask for privacy as we continue to grieve and heal in the wake of this tragedy." A statement from Wendy's sister read, "Wendy was such a kind, fun, loving person. She was bubbly and caring. She adored her family, the same as we all adored her. Wendy had a close bond with her nieces and nephews. Wendy absolutely loved her animals, and always had from being a child. She loved her time living and working on the farm. This was when she was at her happiest. Wendy was such a lovely, kind person that she always had groups of friends throughout her life who thought the world of her. And since she has died, listening to her friends and others speak so well about her means so much to us as family, as we know how special she was. But hearing this from others makes it more special, and knowing everything that is being said about Wendy is sincere. Our minds are constantly full of the question that is constantly in our minds, is why? Why would Brian Whitelock do this to the person who gave him little jobs just so he had cash in his pocket, so he could put food on his table and feed his dog, or as Wendy did on occasions, buy him shopping? Brian Whitelock has robbed us of our sister, auntie, friend, the conversations that will be no more. There will always be an empty void, an empty chair. Brian Whitelock may only be a small man. However, Wendy was an elderly lady. She would have never been able to fight him off. We can never move on from this. However, we want justice for our sister and auntie. This is what she deserves, and nothing less. We want closure from a legal process and the difficulties that this has been. No sentence that Brian Whitelock receives will ever be enough for us as a family. However, we want him to know what he has done to us as a family. The nightmares we have because of his actions and the life sentence he has given us, we can never, ever escape this. Most importantly, for him to know that he has taken the life of his friend. The person who never did him any wrong, when his only fault was to care too much and believing everyone deserved a second chance. She believed she could help you, Brian Whitelock, and this is how you repaid her kindness and her friendship by taking her life. The very last thing I've got to say is the probation service did comment on this. They said they was conducting a review, and the parole board spokeswoman said, "One case is one tragedy too many, and we take these extremely seriously. Where this happens, the parole board is committed to doing everything it can to learn the lessons that will help to prevent further tragedies." As you know, I like to finish my cases with helpful information, but you know there ain't any. Sorry, my eyes are watering. There ain't any. Eat shit. And maybe, just maybe, if there's a lesson to be learned, it's that if somebody kills someone cold-bloodedly, or if someone's addicted to drugs and they can't stop, but they kill people while they're on drugs, then maybe we shouldn't let them out. Do you know, it's just an idea. Manslaughter's one thing. Letting someone out that's accidentally killed someone, fair enough. But to let someone out that's so fucking horrible. And I don't think probation services, I don't think the parole board is held enough to account. I'm sorry, I don't. I don't care, you point on that. And, do you know, I wouldn't want the job myself. I think we should all stay inside. But if I'd have let someone out that would have gone on to kill someone, I don't think I'd be sleeping at night for a very long time. The other lessons in this video are self-explanatory. The only thing I want to say last is don't comment on this video saying anything about Wendy's trusting nature being a downfall. Don't do that. Don't let evil, vicious monsters like Brian Lyndon Whitelock be an example of why we shouldn't try and help people, because that's not good enough. I refuse to let Brian Lyndon Whitelock put a patch on this earth any darker than he already has done. So them sorts of comments won't be welcomed. I'm not saying that you can't think that. I'm just saying, I know we don't need that negativity. It was not Wendy's fault what happened at all. At all. The probation board said that he was safe to be out. She trusted that and she trusted him. That's not her fault. That is not her fault. So, with that said, all I'm saying is, I love you. Take care of yourself. Take care of those around you, I don't know. All I'm saying is, I love you. Take care of yourself. Take care of those around you. And I'll see you real soon. Hopefully in a few weeks, because I'm getting closer to doing one a fortnight. So close. Speak to you soon. Bye.